struggle for the soul of education in North America is playing out on the road before us. Kincheloe, 2005, page 12. Hello, Internet. Today I want to talk about a book that I recently picked up, one that I've wanted to get my hands on for a long time. I've read excerpts and a chapter or two from it in the past, but I've always felt uneasy that I couldn't sit down and plow through the whole thing, because I knew this book was one that tied everything together nicely. And by everything, I mean everything woke. If you don't know, there is a technical term for what everyone is correctly identifying as being woke. And that technical term is critical consciousness. Critical consciousness. Normal consciousness is being awake and aware of your surroundings, like literally awake, not sleeping or unconscious. Critical consciousness is also being awake, but in a very different way. A person who has critical consciousness has awakened a more elevated consciousness, a consciousness that pushes them to read their world critically and take action to transform their world in pursuit of the prophetic vision of social justice. In layman's terms, someone who has awakened their critical consciousness believes that everything in society is designed to oppress them, and the only way to see the truth about the world is to become a Marxist who practices critical theories. There's a lot to unpack there, but I would argue that unless you understand that what we call woke means having a critical consciousness, that is, being spiritually and religiously awakened to what they think is a more elevated state of being human, you can't possibly understand what's really going on with all of the woke stuff. The technical term for being woke must be understood because it unlocks the whole program. If you know that being woke means being critically conscious, then you can make sense of so much of what's going on in schools today. Which brings me back to the book that I recently picked up. The book is Critical Constructivism by Joe Kincheloe. This book is all about explaining what critical consciousness is, and it argues that we must transform schooling in America to help children develop it. More specifically, the book argues that teachers must develop a critical consciousness of their own. They must awaken to the prophetic vision of social justice first, so they can then lead their students to the promised land. In short, the book argues that teachers should be critical constructivists, which is the technical term from someone who has developed critical consciousness. If you have a critical consciousness, you are no longer a person who is simply awake and aware of your surroundings. You are now someone who actively transforms your surroundings, actively transforms your world according to the prophetic vision of your postmodern neo-Marxist faith. Actively transform schools so you can critically construct a new social order to achieve social justice. I've been studying woke for a while now. I've known that woke means having a critical consciousness, and being critically conscious pushes you to be a critical constructivist, a woke activist. But it wasn't until recently that I could feel so utterly validated in the claims I and so many others have made about what woke is and what's really going on in schools. This isn't a new book. It might surprise you that it was published in 2005, and it might also surprise you that Joe Kincheloe wasn't some, fringe figure in education. According to his Wikipedia page, he was a professor and research chair at McGill University in Montreal. He wrote more than 45 books and hundreds of articles about critical pedagogy, educational research, curriculum, cultural studies, etc. He had 3 graduate degrees from the University of Tennessee, and he has amassed tens of thousands of citations in the education literature. Kincheloe has been enormously influential in the lives of your children, a fact that many of you are likely unaware of. Kincheloe, like all of the other people who have radically reshaped educational content, policy, and practice over the last 50 years, received his education after the critical turn in education. I don't want this to be a big history lesson about the critical turn and how someone like Kincheloe comes to believe what he believed, but I can't help but share this quote yet again from Isaac Gottesman, a Marxist educational scholar who published an extremely insightful and award-winning book back in 2016 that explained from the perspective of a Marxist educator how education schools were completely captured by Marxists by the 1990s. Here's the quote taken from page 1, paragraph 1 of Gottesman's The Critical Turn in Education, From Marxist Critique to Post-Structuralist Feminism to Critical Theories of Race, published by Routledge in 2016. Quote, to the question, where did all of the 60s radicals go? The most accurate answer, noted Paul Boole in his classic Marxism in the United States, would be neither to religious cults nor yuppiedom, but to the classroom. After the fall of the New Left arose a new left, an academic left. For many of these young scholars, Marxist thought, and particularly what some refer to as Western Marxism or neo-Marxism, and what I will refer to as the critical Marxist tradition, was an intellectual anchor. As participants in the radical politics of the 60s entered graduate school and moved into faculty positions and started publishing, the critical turn began to change scholarship throughout the humanities and social sciences. The field of education was no exception. Joe Kincheloe was one of these young Marxist scholars Gottesman was referring to. He was one of the many radicals who was responsible for turning education away from whatever it was before and reorienting it towards education for critical consciousness. This book by Kincheloe, Critical Constructivism, was published in 2005. 20 years after Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy took all of our prestigious education schools by storm. 15 years after queer theory and critical race theory, themselves the product of the critical turn in education, took the academy by storm and started making their way into schools. 10 years after Gloria Ladson-Billings popularized both culturally relevant teaching and critical race pedagogy, critical race pedagogy for schools. Critical constructivism succinctly and precisely lays out the polished product that so many religious fanatics have been working on for so long in the academy. A product that radicals feverishly created to transform children from conscious individuals into critically conscious collectivists. A product meant to produce a new social order to achieve their prophetic vision of social justice. Okay, with that out of the way, I can begin to use Joe Kincheloe's words to help you better understand what the hell I've been rambling about. I'm only going to work through chapter 1 of the book today, but I plan on working through the others in future episodes. Maybe not all of them, because once you understand the big picture, things get repetitive. Or maybe I'll do none of the others. I don't know. The first one is the one that matters. Okay. Kincheloe doesn't mince words, and he jumps right into the thick of it, launching chapter 1 with one hell of a statement. And remember, this book is about schools and teaching teachers and teaching kids. Quote, while many view constructivism and critical constructivism as theories of learning, I see them as this and much more. Critical constructivism involves theoretical work in education, epistemology, cognition, and ontology. In critical constructivism, I argue for a unified theory where all of these dimensions fit together and are synergistic in their relationship. In this unified context, critical constructivism becomes and I'm going to slaughter this, Weltanschauung, a worldview that creates meaning on the nature of human existence. End quote. So what Joe's saying is, this project he's describing isn't just about a theory of how humans learn or how we should teach things in schools. It's not just about receiving an education. It's an epistemology, a certain way of thinking about how we know what we know. It's about cognition, a process of acquiring knowledge and understanding, a theory of turning the lights on, if you will, a theory of what our consciousness means. What is it? How does it work? How could it work? And it's an ontology, a theory of what it means to be, what it means to exist in the world, what it means to be human. Kincheloe tells us critical constructivism has something to do with a unified theory of how we know what we know, how our consciousness comes to acquire knowledge and understanding, how we become conscious, and what the nature of human existence is. It's a worldview that creates meaning on the nature of human existence. The point of this book is arguing that education should deliver a worldview to children, his worldview, a worldview that will bestow meaning to children on the nature of human existence. Kincheloe now dives into several key points he wants to make in this chapter. There are 4 main points, and I'll list them in the description of this video, but I'm not going to refer to them and quote Kincheloe chronologically because I think the way he lays it out is dumb. I think it's dumb. I'm going to clear this text and reorder some things so they can make more sense to us. Okay. Kincheloe's starting point in his, again, I'm going to slaughter this, Weltanschauung, is that, quote, critical constructivism is grounded on the notion of constructivism. Constructivism asserts that nothing represents a neutral perspective. Nothing exists before consciousness shapes it into something perceptible. End quote. This is a fundamental building block of the entire woke worldview. What does it mean? It means that there is no objective way of viewing the world. None. It means that, as Kincheloe states, no truly objective way of seeing exists. What appears as objective reality is merely what our mind constructs. Kincheloe is saying we can't access reality because reality has to pass through our minds first, and our minds are part of that reality, influenced by it. We can't get out of reality and look at it from a God's eye view. That's what he's getting at. This belief leads to a few conclusions. If everything is constructed by the mind, the implication is that there is no such thing as a value-free, neutral, and objective way of viewing anything. Anything. If you think this way, everything, the whole world, your whole world, becomes politicized. If no one can access the real world, if everyone has to deal with a filter in their head that reality must pass through, so that what makes it into your mind is unalterably influenced by your perspective, your fears, your desires, experiences, hopes, and dreams, unalterably influenced by your consciousness, your brain's mental models, then no one can claim, ever, that they have reasoned their way to the truth about anything. It's just their personal opinion, which, if tied to any sort of authority or power, becomes a political opinion that can be weaponized and forced on everyone else to tell them how to be in the world. And this is precisely why Kincheloe jumps from everything is a social construct to critical theory. Quote, critical constructivists take this understanding of social construction and add critical theory to the mix. End quote. Now, I'm not going to do a side quest and discuss critical theory for the next hour, but you need to know that the critical theory Kincheloe is referring to is the critical theory of the Frankfurt School. He says so himself. Quote, critical constructivism is grounded on the Frankfurt School's formulation of critical theory. End quote. There it is. The same critical theory crafted by Marxists in the early 20th century to subvert and transform Western societies. The critical theory that Max Horkheimer says is a tool to endlessly tear away at the negative aspects of society, from the Marxist standpoint, of course, to reveal an emancipated human being, a proper communist. Kincheloe says, quote, critical theory is concerned with extending a human's consciousness of himself or herself as a social being in light of the way dominant power operates to manage knowledge. Critical theory is concerned with extending a human's consciousness of himself or herself as a social being in light of the way dominant power operates to manage knowledge. Critical constructivism thus promotes reflection on the production of self." End quote. If the world is socially constructed, then we are socially constructed. We, as human beings, build and determine what we are, what the nature of human existence is. That's what Kincheloe is saying. He's saying we produce ourselves. We are the product of ourselves. He's completely throwing out the idea of a God as someone like a Christian might conceive of one, a God that made us in his image. He's throwing out a naturalistic explanation of human nature, the one that says we are the products of billions of years of evolution, and we discovered a scientific methodology that allows us to increasingly understand the truth, as in capital T, truth, about the world. Increasingly allows us to discover things that correspond to reality, allows us to correspond to reality in our own lives, to discover truth to such an extent that we can launch satellites into space and view the universe as it was billions of years ago. Kincheloe is saying everything is made up. Everything. Even us. We are social constructs that we create. We produce ourselves. We are the creator. Not God, not the universe, us. Communists are always narcissists. It's just unfathomable narcissism. Okay, so we produce ourselves as social beings, he says. What does that mean? Well, I'm not born in a vacuum. As Uncle Carl says, the tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. I'm born in a world where humans have already created society, customs, rules, regulations, laws, institutions, etc., etc. These things, according to Kincheloe, condition my consciousness, delimit the range of experiences I can have. Society's social constructions create me. Other people's thoughts, the thoughts of dead and living generations, enter my head and make me. I make them. Our consciousness is social. We have a social consciousness, a collective consciousness, precisely the argument that Karl Marx's entire program is based on. Precisely the idea behind what Marx called our species being. As Marx says in 1852 in his 18th Brumaire on Louis Bonaparte, quote, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. Their tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living." End quote. The dead and living generations set up society a certain way that I didn't choose and wasn't a part of. I'm born, to return to Kincheloe's quote, in light of the way dominant power operates to manage my knowledge. My knowledge. Society is socially constructed by dominant groups, they're called privileged people nowadays, who use their position in a social and political hierarchy to manage what knowledge passes as knowledge, and what people can be considered knowers of knowledge. Quote, "Critical theory is always concerned with the way power operates and the way various institutions and interests deploy power in an effort to survive, shape behavior, and gain dominance over others." End quote. What better way to gain dominance over others than to control what counts as facts and the truth for others? Remember, in critical constructivism, objectivity doesn't exist. The discovery of the scientific method doesn't matter in this worldview. None of us are capable of going out into the real world and discovering truth for ourselves. Capital T, truth, for ourselves. There is no truth to discover outside of what's in our collective minds, outside of what we have completely made up. Thus, as Kincheloe says, quote, "Critical constructivism is a theoretically grounded form of world-making. As critical constructivists remake and rename their world, They are constantly guided by their critical theoretical system of meaning, their emancipatory source of authority." End quote. Critical constructivism is the idea that everything is socially constructed, and we can come to know that everything is socially constructed. Therefore, we can take control of this constructive process and remake our world. We are world builders. And not just our world, we can remake ourselves. We have an emancipatory source of authority, a God source of authority, to remake our world and remake ourselves. Quote, "Critical theory," he says, "understands that humans are the historical products of power. Men and women do not emerge outside the process of history." End quote. We make history, and history makes us. We are the products of the history we continually make. We can arrest this process, get our hands on the steering wheel. We can produce a new type of man, an emancipated man who lives in a world without unjust dominant power, without oppression, without some groups being more privileged than others, without the bourgeoisie, without whiteness, without heteronormativity. See how this works? Kincheloe is saying we can develop a critical consciousness. Not a normal consciousness, a critical consciousness. A consciousness informed by constructivism and critical theory. A consciousness that makes us critical constructivists who are driven to remake the world in our own image. We can awaken and become woke and remake our world to achieve social justice by perpetually tearing apart the negative aspects of society that we wish to change, which, if we do it long enough, will reveal the utopia on the other side of the rubble, we are told. Quote, "Critical constructivism allows teachers and students a critical consciousness. This involves an ability to step back from the world as we are accustomed to perceiving it, and to see the ways our perception is constructed via linguistic codes, cultural signs, race, class, gender, and sexual ideologies, and other often hidden modes of power. Such ability constitutes a giant step in becoming a critical analyst, learning to be an emancipatory teacher, and assuming the role of producer of dangerous, world-changing knowledge." End quote. Oh, we are in it now. We have a worldview of what it means to be human, and not only that, we have a worldview that creates a system of belief and practice based on that worldview. To be a critical theory, according to the man who coined the term, you must have a theory and a practice. You must take your theory into the world and practice it. Marxists call this praxis. When Kincheloe says critical constructivism is constructivism plus critical theory, he means a critical theory of constructivism, a critical theory that informs the constructive process, demands the constructive process play out in a certain way to emancipate human beings from the evil and oppressive constructs that critical theory identifies. In other words, if you have critical consciousness, if you are a critical constructivist, you have a duty of conscience. You can't know that this is how the world works and not do anything about it. Kincheloe says that, quote, "When we attempt to remain neutral, we support the prevailing power structure." End quote. You can't be aware of some deep injustice and not do anything about it. That makes you a bad person. That places you on the wrong side of history. Silence is complicity. Silence is violence. We can't be not racist. We must be anti-racist. We must use the pronouns. Is this making sense? How about teaching is a political act? No teaching is neutral. Where have we heard that before? Outside of teachers' unions, every single one of the ed schools, and all of the talking heads on TV. Where do you think they got that idea? Quote, "Educational purpose cannot be separated from social justice." Hold on. Let me start that again so you can hear it again. quote, educational purpose cannot be separated from social justice. The purpose of education is social justice. There it is. Cannot be separated from social justice, human liberation, self-direction, resistance to regulation, community building, deeper forms of human interconnection, and the fight for freedom. End quote. Oh, didn't know that's what education was about, but here we are. Oh, I've got another quote that's part of that, actually. Quote, thus, recognition of the ideological nature of teaching and knowledge production implies that the teachers and researchers, by necessity, must take a position and make it explicit. End quote. Yeah, I wonder why all the teachers are political nowadays, huh? For a century, the Marxists have been trying to solve the problem of reproduction. The idea that they can't kickstart their revolutions in the West because the West reproduces itself through schools, through teaching kids that certain things that inoculate those children from the revolutionary commie virus, teaching kids that capitalism is good, teaching kids that reason, logic, and rationality are universal human tools that grant each of us the ability to go out into the world and uncover truth about the nature of our reality. I quoted Gottesman earlier. His entire book is about how Marxists solved the problem of reproduction and took over our educational system. An entire book about how critical constructivists took over schools so they can make critical consciousness the central learning objective in education. And of course they did. They did because everything I've described is how they think the world works. They knew they must capture schools to remake the world in their image. They think that schools only exist to deposit certified truths, which are just wholly fabricated political opinions in their worldview, into the minds of kids so those kids will grow up and conserve the system, conserve the current socio-political order. Side note, anyone who isn't a critical constructivist is a conservative in this worldview. More than that, anyone who isn't a critical constructivist in this worldview is a fascist. Because the critical theorists thought that capitalism inevitably collapses into fascism. A lot of people who would call themselves liberals or defenders of liberalism have been caught very off guard in recent years when saying things like, there are two sexes, and they were called a fascist for it. Caught way off guard when they were called fascists for saying things like, reverse discrimination is discrimination, or called a fascist for saying that Ibram X. Kendi was a racist for saying that the only remedy for past discrimination is present discrimination. What a joke. A lot of very good liberals still don't understand why they are harassed, berated, shamed, and struggled for not adopting the most insane political positions. They don't yet know that they are conservatives. Anyway, critical constructivists think schools conserve an unjust system. So they took over schools to remake those schools in their image, to remake them so that those schools would work to awaken a critical consciousness in children, make children critical constructivists, make kids woke activists. At this point, you may have noticed a glaring contradiction. Marxists love their contradictions. In the constructivist idea that all knowledge and truth is subjective and intersubjective. If that's the case, how can these wackos claim that their worldview and way of educating children is better than anyone else's? How can they claim that they should get the steering wheel if everything is just made up? I return to Kincheloe when he says that critical constructivists have a, quote, emancipatory source of authority, end quote. That source of authority, they claim, comes from the idea that they are awakened. They have critical consciousness. They know this is how the world works and everyone else doesn't. They are informed by critical theory, which seeks, as Horkheimer stated in the last century, to emancipate human beings. On contrived Marxist terms, of course. They get to be the ultimate wielders of what emancipation means because they claim to possess the secret knowledge about the state of human affairs. The secret knowledge about what makes us human, our social nature, our collective consciousness and ability to realize that this is how the world works and grab the steering wheel of history. For them, truth isn't relative. It's not my truth versus your truth, even though this is precisely how it plays out in the real world. The real world that hits you in the damn face when your beliefs are false. Truth for them is social. It's relational. Meaning, quote, constructions considered true are contingent upon the power relations and historical context in which they are formulated and acted upon, end quote. Okay, that begs the question. In Kincheloe's own words, quote, the question that grounds our attempt to formulate a critical constructivist system of meaning to ground pedagogy, that's teaching kids, and social action, that's activism, is if what we designate as truth is relational and not certain, not objective, then what set of assumptions can we use to guide our activities as professionals, as teachers, to inform our questions as cultural workers? End quote. In other words, if it's all made up in our individual and collective heads, what should guide our teaching practices and how do we orient our activism in the right direction? What's our North Star, the thing that guides us to how we construct the world? The answer, according to Kincheloe, like Paulo Freire before him, is liberation theology, also known as Marxist Christianity. I'm not going down that rabbit hole today, but I highly, highly recommend you check out James Lindsay's series about critical pedagogy on the New Discourses podcast and the work that he's done on Paulo Freire to learn more. If you're not already, you need to be listening to the New Discourses podcast. Sorry, I've got a cold and I'm all stuffy. To the question, what do we do now that we know how to make the world, but we also know there is no universal objective truth that we can access, Kincheloe says, quote, liberation theology, with its roots deep in Latin American struggle against poverty and colonialism, morally situates our attempt to formulate an explicit set of assumptions, an ethical starting line from which to begin our formulation of educational questions. Proclaiming their solidarity with the marginalized, liberation theologians work alongside them in their attempt to expose the existing social order as oppressive and unethical. All aspects of our emancipatory system of meaning and scholarship and pedagogy that grow out of it rests on the notion of identification with the perspective of the oppressed. Accordingly, one of the main goals of critical constructivism is to reveal the ways that dominant schooling serves to perpetuate the hopelessness of the subjugated. On the basis of this knowledge, of their dangerous memory, strategies for overcoming such oppression can be developed. End quote. The critical constructivists tell you that, although everything is made up, they have the moral authority, the emancipatory authority to tell everyone that we're getting in the car and they're driving. The woke say, we're on the side of the oppressed, so what we say goes. How can anyone be against us? We're the little guy. We're for the little guy. Are you okay with oppression? Defined by our terms, of course. Are you okay with people being poor? Are you okay with racism? Do you want a dead daughter or a new son? Shouldn't everyone have a living wage? The world is going to end in 12 years and everyone is going to be dead if you don't radically reshape all of society. Just own nothing and be happy. Bigots. The critical constructivists tell you that the way they're going to make everyone go along with this is by constructing a moral extortion racket. They are the great emancipators. Therefore, they should be in charge of our schools and the future of humanity. Jeez. Okay, how does this all play out in schools? Well, since everything is constructed then what really matters in education, what kids really need to be taught, is how to get to the bottom of how social and political power manifests itself in our interpretations of everything that is constructed. How social and political power manifests itself in our interpretations of social constructions. i.e., what really matters is teaching kids how to view everything through the lens of critical Marxist theory. Only then will they know how the world really works and be equipped to emancipate themselves and society from oppression. Kincheloe, critiquing the old, decrepit, traditional, proven methods of education, says this, quote, "Education was trivialized in that the role of the teacher involved passing certified truths along to passive students whose role was generally to commit such unexamined truths to memory. This perspective of what a rigorous education involves is still promoted by conservatives in the 21st century." End quote. And again, when he says conservatives, he means all of you that are not going along with this program. You are conservatives. Welcome. This is straight from the pages of Paulo Freire, and I again recommend going and listening to the New Discourses podcast on the topic, or picking up The Marxification of Education by James Lindsay to get a book-length treatment on this idea. Kincheloe is saying that teachers take what dominant groups in society want children to learn and feed those certified truths, not real truths, not objective truths, certified truths, approved truths, privileged truths, into the minds of kids to stabilize an oppressive, unjust, unfair social order. What educators really should be doing is focusing on teaching kids how to interpret the knowledge they are receiving. The knowledge they are receiving is not objective. It's not the truth. It's constructed by systems of power that must be interpreted to determine how that power shapes human beings, privileging some and oppressing others, to determine how that power maintains the status quo while snuffing out the revolutionary flames. Kincheloe says, quote, "Knowledge of the world is an interpretation produced by people who are a part of that world." That's constructivism. Thus, understanding the nature of interpretation is a central feature of being an educated person. In other words, viewing the world through the lens of critical theory is a central feature of being an educated person. That's what he's saying. You're not educated unless you're a damn Marxist who practices critical theories. Kincheloe continues, quote, "Critical constructivists are profoundly appreciative of the power of critical hermeneutics. If hermeneutics involves the act of interpretation, then critical hermeneutics involves understanding how power inscribes the world and the word to shape the nature of human beings." How power inscribes the word and the world to shape the nature of how human beings make sense of it. In other words, critical hermeneutics is directly concerned with how power enters into the interpretive act. All knowledge is socially constructed in a dialogue between the world and human consciousness. End quote. The woke think kids must be taught how to critically interpret what they are learning in their reading lessons, their math textbooks, and their social studies. I'm going to quote here from The Queering of the American Child by myself and James Lindsay, because I don't know how to get what is really happening here in this point across more clearly than I did in the following passage. Quote, "A learner in a traditional literacy program can be taught to read, write, and define the word poverty. By demonstrating their ability to read, write, and define the word poverty, the learning objective ends. But Freire, Paulo Freire, would argue that this learner hasn't learned anything other than how to read, write, and define the word poverty as the bourgeois ruling class wants them to. For Marxists, you can't read the word poverty without reading the world of poverty. The learning objective isn't met until the learner can explain how poverty is defined in Marxist terms. Whereas a traditional literacy program would define poverty as the state of being poor, a critical literacy program might define poverty as the state of being made poor by an oppressive capitalist system. The bourgeois definition of poverty is said to brainwash people into believing that poverty is neutral and natural, and people fall into it for any number of non-conspiratorial reasons. By reading the word poverty critically, a person is awakened to the Marxist's socio-political analysis. To be poor is to be made poor by an unjust system. To be critically literate is to read words as Marxists do, and therefore to read the world as Marxists do. Freire believed that entire ideologies, in his case capitalism and colonialism, are hidden in the word, and to learn to read a word is to learn how to decode the ideology hiding within it. End quote. That's what Kincheloe is getting at here. Students need to be taught how to interpret the things that they are learning in school in certain ways, in Marxist ways. They need to reach the conclusions that critical theory leads them to. Kincheloe says, quote, "The essence of critical constructivism concerns the attempt to move beyond the formal style of thinking which emerged from empiricism and rationalism, a form of cognition which solves problems." It sure does. Solves problems framed by the dominant paragram, the conventional way of seeing things. End quote. These people aren't asking the same questions. They aren't concerned at all with learning to read and write. They are entirely concerned with power. They only care about looking for power, so all of their questions and all of their learning objectives center on power. Who has the power in this situation? Who has the privilege? Who needs equity? Whose voice must be centered? Whose voice has already been heard and must be excluded? Who gets to build the new world order? And so on, and so on, and so on. They aren't living on the same planet. They don't care that the schools are failing. They don't have the same benchmarks. Why do you think there isn't a moral panic in Chicago over the fact that over 50 schools can't produce a single child who can do math proficiently? Some of these schools are spending $50,000 a year per student, and not one can do math proficiently. Not one. Most of the schools are spending over $20,000 a year per student, and none of the administrators are panicking. There aren't massive protests in the streets over this absolutely catastrophic scandal. It's so hard not to go off right now. I mean, these poor kids. These poor kids. No one seems to care. I would argue that they don't care. Learning to do math isn't the learning objective. Learning to develop critical consciousness is. Learning to be a critical constructivist is. Any kid who won't take to that program doesn't matter to these people. Who cares if they learn nothing? At least they won't reproduce the system. At least we'll get rich while we're conning taxpayers into handing over more and more money for the most uneducated group of Americans ever to be pumped out of the system. A fluid mass of extremely manipulatable people who can be activated when the moment's right. Quote, "The way that schools distinguish bright from stupid, good citizenship from bad, model behavior from disruptiveness, good work from bad work, are constructions that emanate from those in a position to induce less privileged actors to grant their consent to the dominant definitions." End quote. The woke don't care that schools are failing. They aren't operating in the same universe as you or I. They aren't operating in a universe they are operating in a universe where they think they are becoming God. I can't say it enough, but these people think learning to read and write is oppressive. They don't care about reading or writing or doing math or civics. They don't care. They think learning to do those things creates less privileged actors. They think teaching kids to actually read and write and understand their rights makes them oppressed. They only care about how students feel. They only care about lived experience. They only care about convincing kids that they need to buy into Marx's program. If they have a slogan, it's this: the ruthless criticism of all that exists. People like Kincheloe wanted schools like the ones in Chicago to pump out kids who ruthlessly criticize everything in the system until the system breaks. That's the point of being a critical constructivist, doing critical pedagogy in schools to raise a critical consciousness in children. People like Kincheloe tell you that they think they are gods. They have an elevated consciousness, a critical consciousness, that makes them world builders who are going to liberate humanity. World builders with an emancipatory source of authority. People like Kincheloe are critical constructivists. They have critical consciousness. They are woke. The struggle for the soul of education in North America is playing out on the road before us. Yeah, it sure is. Time to wake up.